In the final decades of the 15th century, Spain was a land on the cusp of transformation. The Reconquista had dragged on for centuries, a war of faith and land between Christian kingdoms and the Muslim rulers of al-Andalus. By 1478, the last bastion of Muslim power, Granada, trembled under siege, and Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile ruled as the newly crowned Catholic monarchs, their marriage uniting Spain's greatest realms. Together, they sought more than political dominion. They dreamed of forging a nation bound by one language, one monarch, and above all, one faith. But unity forged in conquest comes at a price. Beneath the triumphant banners of Christianity lay centuries of cultural exchange. Muslims, Jews, and Christians had coexisted, sometimes uneasily, sometimes in harmony, across Iberia's towns and cities. Their poetry, their architecture, their philosophies had blended to shape one of Europe's richest societies. Now, under the stern gaze of Ferdinand and Isabella, that fragile coexistence was swept aside in pursuit of religious purity. It was in this crucible of suspicion that the Spanish Inquisition was born. On November 1st, 1478, Pope Sixtus IV issued the papal bull Exigit Sincerae Devotionis Affectus, granting Ferdinand and Isabella the right to appoint inquisitors. Their choice was swift and severe. The Dominican friar Tomás de Torquemada, Isabella's confessor, a man of unbending austerity and unrelenting zeal. His very name would become synonymous with fire and fear. Torquemada's vision was clear. Spain must be free of heresy, and those who wavered in their faith must be exposed and punished. Conversos, Jews who had converted to Christianity, sometimes under threat, and Moriscos, Muslims who had submitted to baptism, were his first targets. Outwardly Christians, their sincerity was constantly questioned. Were they truly faithful, or were they practicing forbidden rituals behind closed doors? For the Inquisition, doubt was as damning as evidence. The machinery of fear began to turn almost immediately. In Seville, February 6, 1481, the first auto da fe was staged, a public act of faith in which 6 conversos were bound to wooden stakes and burned alive. Witnesses described the air thick with smoke, the fire consuming flesh, while priests intoned solemn prayers. It was a spectacle designed not only to punish, but to terrify. Tribunals multiplied swiftly. Barcelona, Toledo, Valladolid. Each city housed the dreaded chambers where inquisitors questioned, judged, and condemned. Suspicion seeped into everyday life. A careless remark, a neighbor's grudge, even the choice of food on one's table could lead to arrest. Denunciation became a weapon, and silence a shield too fragile to save anyone for long. The Spanish painter Francisco Goya, centuries later, would capture the spirit of this age in his haunting etchings. Figures in hoods, chained prisoners, flames licking upward toward heaven, the grotesque carnival of piety and cruelty immortalized in ink. In this climate, the Inquisition grew into more than a religious tribunal. It became an institution of control, its shadow stretching across villages and kingdoms alike. Between 1478 and its eventual abolition in 1834, it is estimated that 150,000 people were tried, with thousands condemned to death. Fear became its currency, fire its language, and torture its instrument. As the Italian chronicler Pietro Martire d'Anghiera observed after witnessing an auto da fe in 1487, it was a spectacle full of horror and piety, a sight to strike terror into the soul. Thus began the reign of the Spanish Inquisition, a reign where faith was wielded as a weapon, where suspicion could destroy families, and where the dungeon and the stake awaited those who dared to believe differently. Hunted and condemned, lives shattered under suspicion. As the Inquisition tightened its grip, no group was spared its shadow. Spain's religious minorities, conversos, Moriscos, Protestants, and those accused of sorcery, lived perpetually in the crosshairs of an institution that thrived on fear, suspicion, and obedience. The conversos, Jews who had converted to Christianity to escape persecution, were the first and most frequent victims. To outward eyes, they were Christians, baptized, attending Mass, keeping the holy days. But suspicion poisoned every gesture. A meal cooked on the wrong day, a whispered prayer in Hebrew, or even bathing on Friday evenings could be used as evidence of Judaizing. One tragic example was Luis de Carvajal, born in 1537 in Benavente. Seeking safety, he fled to Mexico, hoping distance from Spain would mean freedom. But the Inquisition followed him across the Atlantic. Arrested, tortured, and condemned, Carvajal was burned alive in Mexico City in 1596, alongside his mother and sisters. Their deaths a grim testament that the Inquisition's reach knew no bounds. The Moriscos, Muslims who had converted under duress, faced the same suffocating scrutiny. For centuries, their families had called Spain home, their mosques rising alongside Christian churches, but under the Holy Office, even their daily lives became a crime. Secretly speaking Arabic, wearing traditional dress or preserving Islamic customs could provoke accusations of heresy. In 1568, despair boiled into rebellion. In the Alpujarras mountains of southern Spain, thousands of Moriscos rose under Ibn Humayya, proclaiming defiance against the crown and the Inquisition. For 3 bloody years, villages burned, soldiers clashed, and rebels were slaughtered. The revolt was crushed, but the punishment was even harsher. Between 1609 and 1614, the Spanish crown decreed the mass expulsion of the Moriscos. Up to 600,000 were driven from their homes, families torn from their land, forced to seek refuge in North Africa or the Ottoman Empire. Chroniclers recorded a sad and pitiful sight, long columns of exiles marching toward an uncertain fate, their villages left empty and their legacy erased. Yet it was not only Jews and Muslims who suffered. Protestants, a rarity in Spain, were hunted with zeal. When whispers of Reformation thought reached Valladolid in 1559, the Inquisition responded with ferocity. Nobleman Carlos de Seso and dozens of others were arrested. At a public auto da fe, flames consumed their bodies as King Philip II and his court looked on. The fire was not just punishment, it was warning. Spain would remain Catholic, and Protestant thought would be stamped out before it could take root. And then there were the witches. Across Europe, hysteria swept through courts and villages, and Spain was no exception. In the Basque Country, 1610, the small town of Zugarramurdi was gripped by accusations of witchcraft. Dozens of women were arrested, accused of gathering in forests for Sabbaths, of dancing with the devil, of brewing storms and casting curses. Torture extracted confessions, and 11 were burned at the stake in Logroño. The king himself, Philip IV, lamented in a 1631 letter the alarming number of witches and demanded harsher action. Behind these cases lay the Inquisition's vast archives, over 75,000 dossiers, each a story of fear and suffering. Neighbors turned against neighbors, children against parents, servants against masters. Miguel de Cervantes, Spain's greatest writer, captured the terror in Don Quixote. The Inquisition is a knife that cuts both ways, striking the innocent as easily as the guilty. The lives of Spain's minorities were transformed into tragedies, whether converso, Morisco, Protestant, or accused witch, each stood under the same dark cloud: suspicion without proof, trial without fairness, punishment without mercy. The flames of the auto da fe burned more than flesh. They consumed centuries of coexistence, silenced entire communities, and left scars that would shape Spain for generations. Trials in darkness, the secret courts of the Holy Office. The Inquisition did not merely wield torture devices, it wielded a legal system so fearsome, so alien to modern notions of justice, that it became a weapon in its own right. Behind its dark wooden doors and shadowy chambers, the Holy Office constructed a machinery of fear that relied as much on procedure as it did on iron and fire. It all began with the secret denunciation. In this world of paranoia, anyone could be accused, and anyone could accuse. A resentful neighbor, a rival merchant, even a jealous family member could whisper suspicion into the ears of the Holy Office. The accused would never know their accuser's identity. To mount a defense was nearly impossible when the charges were vague, the evidence hidden, and the testimony cloaked in anonymity. By 1486, the Inquisition had created an entire network of spies and informants known as familiares. They blended into towns and villages, farmers, merchants, even priests, men and women who lived ordinary lives while serving the Inquisition in secret. Their job was simple: report every rumor, every act of suspected heresy, every suspicious glance or whispered prayer. By the mid-16th century, more than 20,000 of these informants operated across Spain, a silent army of watchers who made suspicion a way of life. Once accused, the victim was summoned before the tribunal. Interrogations stretched for hours, sometimes days. Questions were repeated, twisted, asked in new forms designed to catch inconsistencies. Prisoners were denied lawyers, denied the right to know the evidence, denied any chance at a fair defense. The process itself was meant not to discover truth, but to break the will. Torquemada himself, Spain's first Grand Inquisitor, was notorious for his relentless questioning. Chroniclers wrote of sessions lasting 3 days and nights without rest, until the suspect, delirious from exhaustion, confessed to whatever was demanded. Other inquisitors, like Diego Rodriguez Lucero of Córdoba, became infamous for their sadism, filling their dungeons with screams that echoed through the night. And if interrogation failed, there remained the dreaded question, the official euphemism for torture. Sanctioned by papal decree, it was woven seamlessly into the legal process. Torture was not considered cruelty. It was regarded as a means of uncovering truth. Yet, the truth it produced was often nothing more than words forced through agony, confessions carved out of flesh and bone. Trials concluded in the auto da fe, the act of faith. These public ceremonies were part theatre, part sermon, part execution. Dressed in coarse penitential robes and conical hats known as carrozas, prisoners were paraded through the streets, their heads bowed as priests urged repentance. Crowds gathered in plazas, eager to witness the spectacle. The guilty knelt to hear their sentence: imprisonment, exile, forced labor, or, for the unrepentant, death in the flames. The first auto da fe in Seville, 1481, was only the beginning. Over the next 3 centuries, thousands unfolded, some attended by royalty. One of the most notorious took place in Valladolid, 1559, when 14 Protestants were burned at the stake before the watchful gaze of King Philip II. Artists like Franz Hogenberg immortalized these scenes in engravings, grim platforms, smoking pyres, and a sea of faces turned towards suffering as if it were both ritual and entertainment. The Inquisition's legal machine was designed not for justice, but for submission. By keeping charges secret, by weaponizing torture, by turning trials into public morality plays, it ensured that no subject of the Spanish crown could escape its reach. Even those who escaped the flames lived under the stigma of suspicion, their families tainted, their names recorded in the meticulous archives of the Holy Office. As Miguel de Cervantes once wrote, having felt the shadow of the Inquisition himself, the sound of the lash and the cries of the tortured filled its chambers, and still the people called it justice. In Spain, law and terror became indistinguishable. The Holy Office had perfected not only instruments of torment, but instruments of procedure, a bureaucracy of fear that ensnared entire generations in its iron grip. Engines of pain inside Spain's torture chambers. If the courtroom was the theatre of the Inquisition, then the torture chamber was its engine, the hidden crucible where truth, or what passed for truth, was wrung from the human body, beneath cloisters and palaces, in dungeons reeking of sweat, blood, and despair. The Inquisition perfected the cruel art of extracting confessions. Its arsenal of devices was not simply functional, it was symbolic, designed to terrify even those who never felt their touch. Perhaps the most iconic of all was the rack. Simple in its construction, a wooden frame, pulleys, ropes, and a crank, it was devastating in its effect. The victim lay bound, wrists and ankles secured, while the inquisitors turned the wheel. Slowly, inexorably, limbs stretched, muscles tore, joints dislocated, until bones threatened to snap. Few could withstand more than a few minutes. Confessions spilled forth, real or imagined, as the body begged for release. Some, like the English Jesuit John Gerard, subjected to the rack in 1594, refused to break, but most succumbed, whispering guilt to silence the agony. Then there was the strappado, a device cruel in its simplicity. The prisoners' hands were bound behind their back, and a rope was looped around their wrists before being hoisted high into the air. The body dangled helplessly, suspended by twisted arms. Then, with a sudden slackening of the rope, the victim plummeted, only to be wrenched to a stop before hitting the ground. The shock tore shoulders from sockets, snapped ligaments, and left the victim shrieking in anguish. What made it particularly insidious was that it left little visible mark. A man could emerge from the chamber outwardly whole, yet forever crippled within. The water torture, or toca, preyed not on joints, but on breath itself. Strapped to a bench, a coarse cloth placed over the face, the prisoner felt water slowly poured, seeping into nostrils and mouth. It did not kill, but it mimicked drowning with terrifying precision. Panic overwhelmed even the strongest, the instinct to survive overpowering reason. Words tumbled out, confessions, accusations, anything to make the suffocation stop. Another favorite of the inquisitors was the garrucha. Similar to the strappado, it raised the victim by the wrists bound behind the back, but here weights were tied to the ankles. The added force pulled the body downward, amplifying the tearing of muscles until shoulders ripped apart and arms dangled useless. The mystic Saint John of the Cross endured such torments in 1577, his faith tested as his body broke under the strain. But the Holy Office's arsenal extended far beyond these staples. Some devices were crafted to target specific vulnerabilities. The pair of anguish, a metal instrument inserted into the mouth, rectum, or vagina, expanded as screws were turned, splitting flesh and tearing tissue from within. The head crusher compressed skulls slowly, forcing eyes to bulge and teeth to shatter. The Spanish tickler, iron claws raked across skin, shredded muscle from bone. And then there was the dreaded potro, or wooden horse. Victims were stretched upon its narrow frame, bound at wrists and ankles, while sharp rollers beneath ground against flesh. As inquisitors turned the screws, splinters tore into skin, grinding down until blood soaked the wood. This method, chillingly called the question, reduced men and women alike to broken shells, confessing to crimes they had never conceived just to escape. First-hand testimonies reveal the depths of this cruelty. Maria de la Concepcion, tortured in 1634, recalled, "They laid me bare upon the potro and turned the rollers until my very bones seemed dust. I screamed until my voice was gone, and only then did I confess to everything they demanded, lies upon lies, but spoken to survive." The chambers themselves were instruments of fear, iron rings bolted into stone walls, hooks suspended from ceilings, pools of stagnant water on the floor. The atmosphere alone suffocated hope. Prisoners awaiting interrogation often heard the muffled cries of others, a psychological torment that broke the spirit before the body was touched. The cruelty was methodical. Torture was not random. It was scheduled, recorded, administered in sessions so that victims hovered on the brink of collapse but did not die before confessing. The inquisitors insisted they sought only truth, but truth drowned beneath pain. What mattered was submission, the broken will, the whispered admission, the spectacle of obedience. Instruments of iron and wood, wielded by men of faith, became the tools of an empire built on fear. The Inquisition's chambers of agony were not merely places of punishment. They were factories of confession, engines of control that echoed with the screams of generations. As one Spanish chronicler grimly observed, the Inquisition did not need to execute every heretic. It needed only to let the cries of its victims carry beyond the dungeon walls, so that the people would know obedience is the only safety. The broken and the brave, stories of the Inquisition's victims. The Spanish Inquisition was not content with silencing the nameless masses. Its reach extended into the highest circles of Spain's cultural and intellectual life. From poets and mystics to scholars and theologians, the Holy Office's iron grip spared no one. Their cases were not only tragedies of individuals, but symbols of how fear could consume a nation's very soul. Among the most celebrated victims was Fray Luis de Leon, a theologian, poet, and professor at the University of Salamanca. Born in 1527 to a family of conversos, he became one of the brightest lights of the Spanish Renaissance. His brilliance, however, was his undoing. Accused of translating the Song of Songs into Spanish, a bold act seen as tampering with scripture, he was dragged before the Inquisition in 1572. 4 long years he languished in prison, deprived of his students, his writing, his freedom. From his cell, he wrote verses of lament. "Here I am, Lord, in this dark prison, waiting for the light of your grace." Though eventually acquitted in 1576, his spirit bore scars that never healed. Teresa of Avila, the mystic reformer who founded the Discalced Carmelites, also found herself in the Inquisition's sights. Her visions, her insistence on direct communion with God, her growing influence among the faithful, all raised suspicion. Denounced by rivals, she was accused of heresy and impropriety. Though never convicted, she lived under constant threat, choosing her words with care, knowing that a single misstep could lead her to the flames. In her book of My Life, she confessed, "Many people, out of malice or ignorance, condemned as wrong things that were truly very right." Even in death, the Inquisition could not be defied. In 1559, the remains of Constantine Ponce de la Fuente, a theologian who had perished in prison, were exhumed. His body, along with his effigy, was burned in an auto da fe in Seville. The Inquisition sought not only to punish the living, but to erase the dead, ensuring even their memory was scorched from history. The town of Llerena bore witness to one of the darkest of these tragedies. Between 1485 and 1496, hundreds of conversos were tried, and more than 100 burned at the stake. Entire families were annihilated in single ceremonies. On June 14, 1491, 11 members of one household, including a pregnant woman, were tied to the pyres. Chroniclers described the flames consuming not only bodies, but generations of bloodlines, extinguishing names that had endured for centuries. Spain's intellectuals were not immune. Antonio de Nebrija, author of the first grammar of the Spanish language, drew the Holy Office's suspicion for his critical edition of the Vulgate Bible. Though cleared after defending himself in 1507, he left disillusioned. In a bitter letter he wrote, "In Spain, there is no one who knows Latin well enough to judge my work, and yet they persecute me for it." His lament captured the suffocating air of suspicion that stifled scholarship in Spain's so-called Golden Age, and beyond Spain, the shadow fell too. The Italian philosopher Giordano Bruno, who championed the idea of an infinite universe with countless suns and worlds, was tried by the Roman Inquisition. In 1600, he was marched to Rome's Campo dei Fiori, bound to a stake and burned alive, his ashes cast into the Tiber. His crime, daring to see the cosmos as larger than the Church allowed. His fate became a grim reminder that the Inquisition was not a Spanish scourge alone, but a pan-European tyranny of thought. Perhaps most haunting of all were the women who dared claim spiritual authority. Lucrecia de Leon, a young Madrileña who reported prophetic dreams of Spain's downfall, was arrested in 1590. Branded a false visionary, she was imprisoned for years, her life shattered. Sor Maria de Santo Domingo, once hailed as the Holy Maid of Piedrahita, was likewise imprisoned and interrogated for her visions. The Inquisition was particularly ruthless toward women whose voices carried weight, their spiritual authority perceived as a threat to the patriarchal church. What made these cases especially terrifying was not only the cruelty of their punishments, but the lesson they taught. If the greatest minds, the most devout souls, and the most celebrated figures could fall, then no one was safe. Fear was democratized. Heresy could be found anywhere. The Spanish chronicler Andrés Bernaldez, reflecting on the Llerena trials, wrote, "The Inquisition made such a destruction of conversos that it was a thing of pity and terror." His words echo the duality of the age: pity for the victims, terror for the living who watched and learned that silence, obedience, and submission were the only means of survival. The Holy Office had achieved its aim. By targeting not just commoners but saints, scholars, and visionaries, it silenced the voices that might have inspired resistance. Spain's brightest lights were dimmed, its boldest thinkers shackled, its dreamers imprisoned. The message was clear: genius, faith, or learning offered no protection. Under the Inquisition, brilliance was a liability, and faith itself could be the cause of one's destruction. A silence over Spain, how fear crushed thought and word. If the dungeons and torture chambers were the body of the Inquisition, then censorship was its spirit, an invisible force that seeped into every corner of Spanish life. Beyond flames and racks, the Holy Office wielded another weapon, quieter but perhaps more destructive: the suffocation of thought itself. The first great blow fell in 1502, when Ferdinand and Isabella decreed that no foreign book could enter Spain without inquisitorial approval. What began as a trickle of censorship soon grew into a flood. By 1558, the Index of Prohibited Books, Index Librorum Prohibitorum, was published, a catalogue of forbidden knowledge. With each revision, its reach expanded, swallowing up the works of some of Europe's greatest minds: Erasmus, Galileo, Descartes, Voltaire. Even Spain's own thinkers, poets, and mystics were not spared. The Index was a tool not only of suppression, but of fear. To be found in possession of a banned book was to invite suspicion of heresy. Households burned their own libraries, scholars hid manuscripts, readers whispered verses in secrecy. The flame of curiosity flickered dimly under the Holy Office's relentless gaze. Some bans were particularly telling. Francisco de Osuna, a Spanish mystic whose writings had once inspired Teresa of Avila, saw his Tercer Abecedario Espiritual outlawed in 1559. The satirical novel Lazarillo de Tormes, a cornerstone of Spanish literature, was likewise banned, accused of spreading heretical ideas, though it was mere fiction. In 1624, La Celestina, celebrated as one of Spain's literary masterpieces, was declared obscene and forbidden. Even the stars themselves were placed under lock and key. In 1625, teaching Copernican astronomy in universities was outlawed. The Inquisition did not simply censor, it rewrote the boundaries of what was acceptable to know. Scholars, teachers, even clergy were monitored, their lectures and sermons scrutinized for the slightest hint of deviation. Professors at universities swore oaths of orthodoxy, swearing to report one another for heterodox teaching. A climate of intellectual surveillance prevailed, where every classroom could become an echo of the tribunal. The case of Bartolomé de Carranza, the Archbishop of Toledo, showed how even the highest churchmen were vulnerable. Arrested in 1559 and accused of heresy, Carranza spent 17 years in prison before dying in Rome, still awaiting a verdict. His fall sent ripples across Europe, proving that even loyalty to the Church could not protect one from its own machinery. The playwright Lope de Vega, himself scrutinized by the Inquisition, lamented in El Caballero de Olmedo, "In Spain, the Inquisition is our grammar." His words were not mere metaphor. Language itself became shaped by suspicion, molded by fear. To speak too freely was to risk denunciation. To write too boldly was to invite ruin. The philosopher Quevedo, who endured imprisonment by the Holy Office, sharpened his critique. In Spain, it is a crime to be intelligent. Behind the wry phrase lay bitter truth. Original thought, free inquiry, scientific investigation, all were stifled. Spain, once poised to rival Italy or France in Renaissance brilliance, stagnated beneath the Inquisition's shadow. Even Miguel de Cervantes, whose Don Quixote would become one of the greatest works in world literature, wrote in veiled critique. His portrayal of madness, delusion, and blind devotion can be read as a subtle allegory of the folly of unquestioned authority. As scholar Manuel Duran put it, Don Quixote is a book born out of the ashes of the Inquisition, a mirror held up to a nation struggling under spiritual tyranny. The legacy of this censorship was profound. By silencing its own scholars, Spain condemned itself to intellectual isolation. While Northern Europe embraced the Enlightenment, Spain lagged behind, shackled to orthodoxy. Ideas that might have sparked progress, scientific, philosophical, literary, were smothered before they could take root. José Ortega y Gasset, centuries later, wrote in Invertebrate Spain, "The Inquisition left upon us a soul inclined to intolerance, to dogmatism, to the rejection of the new." He was right. The Holy Office had achieved what armies and torture alone could not. It had reshaped the very habits of mind, training generations to fear curiosity itself. The auto da fe may have consumed bodies, but censorship consumed futures. It was a quieter, more insidious fire, burning in silence across classrooms, libraries, and pulpits, and its smoke lingered long after the pyres themselves had cooled. Empire of fear, the Inquisition's grip on the New World. The reach of the Spanish Inquisition did not end at the Atlantic. As Spanish ships carried conquistadors and settlers to the Americas, so too did they carry the machinery of the Holy Office. From the bustling streets of Mexico City to the high Andes of Peru and the humid coasts of Cartagena, the Inquisition established itself as a pillar of colonial rule, extending fear into lands newly conquered and newly subjugated. The first tribunal was founded in Lima, Peru in 1570, followed quickly by Mexico City in 1571 and Cartagena in 1610. These tribunals wielded the same authority as their counterparts in Spain to root out heresy, enforce Catholic orthodoxy, and impose cultural conformity. But in the New World, their power was more than religious. It was colonial. The Inquisition became a tool to dominate not only settlers, but indigenous peoples and enslaved Africans, ensuring Spain's empire was unified under the cross and crown. Indigenous rituals, once central to daily life, were rebranded as devil worship. Sacred plants like peyote, used for centuries in religious ceremonies, were banned as diabolical substances. Temples and idols were smashed, their fragments scattered, their worshippers punished. In 1539, Atahualpa, the Inca noble, was executed in Cajamarca for idolatry, a signal that even the mightiest heirs of empires would fall before the Inquisition's tribunal. Spanish chronicler Pedro Chiesa de Leon wrote of the event, "The death of Atahualpa was a sorrow and affliction to all the land. The grief spreading across the provinces like a wound. Africans, brought in chains across the ocean, were no less vulnerable. The Inquisition branded their spiritual traditions as sorcery, their gatherings as covens of witchcraft. In 1571, in Cartagena, a group of enslaved Africans accused of practicing forbidden rites were burned alive in a spectacle remembered as the case of the Cartagena witches. The trial sent shockwaves through the colonies, a warning that no matter one's station, native, slave, or settler, all lived beneath the shadow of the Holy Office. Women bore a particular burden. In Veracruz, 1568, Maria de Barcina, accused of witchcraft, endured torture so brutal it left her body shattered, her feet burned with irons, her limbs dislocated upon the rack. At last, she confessed, not because of guilt, but because the alternative was unendurable. Her sentence was exile, her name forever blackened. Her story was one among many, her pain repeated across the Americas. The Inquisition's reach extended even into the world of ideas. Works by Bartolomé de las Casas, the Dominican friar who condemned Spanish cruelty toward the natives, were banned. His short account of the destruction of the Indies, with its vivid depictions of massacres and oppression, was deemed heretical and seditious. To possess it in the colonies was to invite arrest. In silencing Las Casas, the Inquisition silenced one of the few voices pleading for mercy. Yet the New World, vast and untamed, presented obstacles the Inquisition could not always overcome. Mountains, jungles, and deserts shielded indigenous communities beyond Spanish reach. Local clergy sometimes resisted the Holy Office's harshness. In Yucatan, Bishop Diego de Landa, himself infamous for burning Mayan codices, later clashed with inquisitors, attempting more measured conversions. Even Felipe Guaman Poma de Ayala, an indigenous chronicler, dared to write his first new chronicle and good government, over 1,200 pages condemning Spanish abuses and pleading for justice. Risking death, he sent it to the king himself, but resistance was rare and the consequences severe. The Inquisition thrived in the Americas much as it had in Spain, through fear. Dungeons in Mexico City and Lima echoed with screams, plazas filled with auto da fe spectacles, and the people learned quickly that deviation, real or imagined, could mean ruin. Bartolomé de las Casas once wrote, "The cruelty of the Inquisition in the Indies put to shame even the savagery of wild beasts." His words were no exaggeration. In the colonies, the Holy Office fused with the machinery of empire, creating a system that punished not only heresy, but identity itself. The Inquisition in the Americas left scars not only on bodies, but on entire cultures. Indigenous traditions were suppressed, African practices demonized, intellectual dissent erased. Its reign was more than religious persecution, it was cultural annihilation, a dark shadow cast across continents. Ashes of power, the fall of the Inquisition's reign. For more than 3 centuries, the Spanish Inquisition had loomed as one of the most feared institutions in Europe and the Americas. Its dungeons, tribunals, and auto da fe had shaped not only Spain's politics and faith, but its very soul. Yet, by the dawn of the 18th century, cracks began to appear in its once impenetrable facade. A changing world, fueled by reason, enlightenment, and reform, would slowly strangle the Holy Office, until it was reduced from an omnipotent authority to a fading relic of a darker age. The decline began under King Philip V, who ascended the throne in 1700. Unlike his predecessors, Philip was influenced by Enlightenment ideals favoring modernization and royal centralization. In 1714, he issued a decree stripping the Inquisition of the power to censor books without royal approval. Though modest, it signaled a profound shift. The Inquisition was no longer the unquestioned arbiter of truth. For the first time, the crown itself began to assert dominance over the Holy Office. Throughout the 18th century, voices of criticism grew louder. Thinkers like Benito Jerónimo Feijó openly condemned the Inquisition, arguing that its methods bred atheists rather than faithful believers. His Teatro Crítico Universal attacked superstition and called for reason. Gaspar Melchor de Jovellanos, poet and reformer, echoed him, describing the Inquisition as a tribunal of blood, a den of hypocrisy. Scandals further eroded its prestige. In 1767, Pablo de Olavide, a respected reformer, was tried for heresy. His prosecution was clumsy and transparently political, ending in humiliation for the Inquisition. A few years earlier, its persecution of Voltaire had already drawn international outrage, tarnishing its image across Europe. Increasingly, the Holy Office seemed less like a guardian of faith and more like an antiquated monster, wielding cruelty in a world that had begun to outgrow it. The Napoleonic invasion of Spain in 1808 dealt a devastating blow. Amid war and upheaval, liberal reformers saw their chance. In 1813, the Cortes of Cádiz, Spain's first national assembly, abolished the Inquisition outright, declaring it incompatible with justice and humanity. For a brief moment, the centuries-old institution was no more, but reaction came swiftly. Ferdinand VII, restored to the throne in 1814, reinstated the Inquisition, determined to preserve the old order. Yet, the tide of history was against him. Another liberal revolt in 1820 forced the monarchy to again abolish the Holy Office. Though reinstated once more after 3 years, its power was shattered, its authority a shadow of what it had been. Finally, in 1834, Queen Regent Maria Cristina signed the decree that ended the Inquisition once and for all. Its assets were seized by the state, its prisons emptied, its palaces abandoned. The once terrifying Palacio de la Inquisición in Madrid crumbled into disrepair, a haunting metaphor for the institution's fall. What had once been the fiery sword of orthodoxy was now nothing more than memory. The reaction across Spain was telling. Where once the auto da fe had been greeted with hushed reverence, now its abolition was met with relief, even joy. Poet Manuel José Quintana celebrated in his Ode to the Fatherland, "O Inquisition, your cruel tyranny has ended, and now begins the reign of reason, of humane law, and the indelible rights of man, yet the scars endured." From 1478 to 1834, an estimated 150,000 people were tried by the Spanish Inquisition. Between 3,000 and 5,000 were executed, and tens of thousands more endured torture, humiliation, or exile. Beyond the bodies it destroyed lay the futures it erased, the books never written, the discoveries never made, the cultures extinguished beneath its flames. The Spanish philosopher Miguel de Unamuno later reflected, "A good argument can be spoiled by some fool who knows what he is talking about." The Inquisition's fatal flaw was precisely this, its belief that by enforcing faith through fear, it could purify society. In reality, it left behind a legacy of stagnation, silence, and shame. Today, the Spanish Inquisition survives as both cautionary tale and cultural memory. Tourists wander through former dungeons in Seville and Toledo, shuddering at the instruments of agony once employed there. Writers and artists from Goya to modern historians have returned again and again to its horrors, and across the world, the phrase Spanish Inquisition has become shorthand for ruthless persecution, the spectre of justice perverted into terror. Its end came not with fire and spectacle, but with the quiet stroke of a pen. Yet its legacy reminds us that institutions built on fear may endure for centuries, but they cannot outlast the human desire for freedom, reason, and truth. As we look back on its 356 years of existence, we are left with a paradox. The Inquisition sought to defend the faith, yet it betrayed the very principles it claimed to uphold. It sought to preserve order, yet it sowed division. It sought to protect souls, yet it destroyed lives. In the end, the Spanish Inquisition stands as one of history's darkest monuments, a reminder of what happens when faith becomes fanaticism, when law becomes cruelty, and when silence is enforced at the cost of truth.